Let's go ahead and get started. Well, welcome everyone. In fact, welcome to the Gerontological Society of America's inaugural webinar series on climate change and aging. This marks our second webinar in the series. So for folks who have joined for the first time, this is an interdisciplinary international webinar series that was organized by one of GSA's newest special interest group on climate change and aging. I am Dr. Angie Perrone and will be moderating this event. So first, I want to thank the Gerontological Society of America for helping us host this webinar series, especially Gina Schoen and Jason Baker for their wonderful behind-the-scenes help. Second, I want to thank Dr. Leah Alon, Dr. Ann Mitchell, and Dr. Patricia Hain for their work through GSA's Special Interest Group on Climate Change and Aging to help organize this event. And then I also want to thank our two fabulous, very distinguished speakers for agreeing to speak for our second webinar for this series. So now I want to introduce our two very distinguished speakers that we are very thrilled to have here. We're going to start with Dr. Michael Mick Smyer. Dr. Smyer is the founder and CEO of Growing Greener, Climate Action for a Warming World. With the support for Stanford's Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design, the D School, Dr. Smyer taps expertise in psychology and human-centered design to move people from anxiety to action to habit on climate change. Growing Greener views people not solely as potential victims of climate change, but also as potential leaders of climate action. He's the former provost and an emeritus professor of psychology at Bucknell University, and also a senior fellow in social innovation at Babson College. As a national expert, he has written and lectured extensively on aging. In addition to holding leadership roles in national organizations on aging, Dr. Smyer has also consulted with Fortune 500 companies, state and national legislative leaders, and higher education organizations on the impacts of aging. His most recent book with Dan Siegel and Sarah Qualls is Aging and Mental Health. He's also published a growing body of scholarship addressing climate action and aging. Additionally, fun fact, as a native of New Orleans, Dr. Smyer provides vocals and nuanced washboard with the Rustical Quality String Band, including on their most recent CD, Back Cottage. His talk is called Your Climate Journey, Breaking the Climate Avoidance Habit. And then he's going to talk after he's done. We're going to hear from Professor Leah Alon, who is a professor in the School of Social Work at Bar Ilan University in Israel. She is currently funded to study ageism in the context of climate change, and was the Israeli PI of the EU-funded Mask Age program to study aging masculinities in literature and cinema. She was also the coordinator of an international EU-funded PhD program on ageism from 2017 to 2022, and between 2014 and 2018, led an international network on the topic of ageism funded through COST, C-O-S-T, Cooperation in Science and Technology. She consults both national and international organizations concerning the development and evaluation of programs and services for older adults. In recognition of her work, she was selected by the UN Decade of Healthy Aging as one of the 50 world leaders working to transform the world to be a better place in which to grow older. She's published numerous scholarly articles on climate change and aging, including most recently articles on intergenerational relations in the context of climate change. Her talk is called Ageism, Intergenerational Solidarity, and Intergenerational Conflict in the Age of Climate Change. So we have two fantastic speakers who are going to have some wonderful information to share. So I am going to ask everyone, just a reminder to please mute yourself if you haven't done so already. We'll do Q&A at the end. And now I will turn to Mick. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Angie, and thanks for having me. So there I was, worried. I had just started a sabbatical, trying to figure out what, as gerontologists call it, my bridge job would be, my bridge from full-time work to full-time retirement. And I thought I had come up with a good topic, aging and climate change. What could go wrong connecting two global patterns, population aging and climate change? I wanted to work on something important. Climate change is important. But what do I bring to that as a gerontologist? Old people. I naively thought I'll just join the hundreds of people who are already working in this area. After talking to all 6 of them, I realized there's a lot more work to do. But there I was in front of a world-class climate communicator, giving my pitch for why the intersection of these two global patterns was important. He and his research team listened very politely, and then he said one word, huh. And I thought, this is not going well. And over the next 6 months, I did the same thing with various research groups, and I kept getting the one word answer, huh. And then they would go on and play with the ideas. And that's when I realized that, huh, is science talk for, I never thought about that, huh. And that's the point. At that time, and this was about 8 years ago, people were not thinking about the intersection of aging and climate change. And that's what I've been doing over the last several years in the organization that Angie mentioned, Growing Greener. And what I'm going to tell you about today is the work that we developed for a variety of engagement strategies in breaking what I call the climate avoidance or climate silence habit. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm going to start with two quick questions, and I'm going to ask you to answer these quick questions in the chat. Just type in the numbers, and then Angie, if you can read out what answers we get. The first is, what percentage of the United States public are worried about global warming? And for our international colleagues, I'm sorry, these are US data that I will be citing. What percentage of the US are worried about global warming? Just type in the chat, and Angie, if you can read off the numbers you're seeing.
Sure, we have 20%, 15%, 80%, big range here, 50%.
15 to 80%. Okay. Well, the answer, and these data come from the Yale program on climate change communication, is about 2/3, 66% of Americans say they're worried about global warming. These are the most recent data that just came out from the Yale program on climate change communication. Second of two questions, and then the quiz will be over. What percentage of Americans say they talk with family members and friends about global warming? What percentage? We know 2/3 are worried. Now, what percentage actually talk about it with their family members and friends? And again, just type your answers in the chat. And Angie, if you can give us a sense of the range. You did so well the first time.
So 5%, and then 80% is the high end.
5 to 80%. Somebody's, boy, 80% is very popular. Well, the answer is about a third, 34%. Again, these are Yale data. So what we have is a disconnect. People are worried, but they don't talk about it. And that's what I call the climate silence or climate avoidance habit. And it goes something like this. Climate change, whoa, it's so big. What can one person do? I'm just not going to talk or think about it. And because of that, we underestimate the extent to which our climate concern is shared. And we keep ourselves from taking action with those who share that concern. By the way, these data come from Jennifer Marlin at the Yale Center in a special issue of the Generations the ASA Generations Journal on Aging and the Climate Crisis. And she pointed out that there's very little difference among the generations in their climate concern. Now, the Yale folks say we can distinguish 6 different communication segments when it comes to climate. Those ranging from those who are alarmed, those who have the highest belief, most concerned, and most motivated, to those who are dismissive. In our work, we're focused on what I call the worried middle, the roughly 44% or so who are concerned and cautious. These are the people who know something's going on, but don't know what to do about it. When you add them to the alarmed, you realize you have 70% of the population ready to take action. And so our challenge that we've been focusing on is reaching that worried middle. How are we going to do that? By developing a series of engagement tools. And today I'll tell you about some work we've been doing with older adults, because we believe with James Baldwin that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. So how do we do that? Well, we actually follow guidelines from the National Academy of Sciences on how to talk to kids about climate change. It turns out these guidelines work for any age group. Keep it social, short, and positive. Kind of like me, social, short, and positive. Social by focusing on people or places that you care about. we focus on place. Short, by focusing on a human scale time frame, not your carbon footprint in 10,000 years, but a human scale time frame. We focus on 40 to 50 years. And positive, we make sure that people leave with a next step that they can take. And we'll talk about why that's important in a little while. See, I believe we're each on a climate journey, and we feel better when we know where we are in that journey and what our next step is. My own climate journey started in 2005. Why 2005? Well, as Angie said, I was born and raised in New Orleans. I know I don't sound like it. And even though I wasn't there at the time, I wasn't living in New Orleans when Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005. Watching my hometown flood and the death and destruction that followed was a real heartbreak for me. That was my wake-up call to extreme weather and climate change issues. I'd been focused on gerontology, and little did I know that I needed to become a climate literate gerontologist. Now, if you ever think about my home state of Louisiana, maybe this is the image you have. The Gulf is in the south, Mississippi's over here, Texas is over here. But the reality is this: the wetlands that used to protect the coast have been decimated by a combination of natural and human causes. So now when a storm like Katrina comes ashore, it's much stronger and has much more devastating impact. So that was my first step in my climate journey. And it accelerated 7 years ago with the birth of some of the best looking grandkids in the world, twins, that's Gus and Bailey, flanking their little brother Rowan, who often looks that way between the twins. And I can't forget their cousin Teddy. So what do these goofballs have to do with climate change? Well, obviously they're a proxy for future generations. And now it's easy for me to think about what the world will be like in very few years when they're my age. And that's part of my motivation for climate action. Now, in our climate journey workshop, we very quickly shift from my climate story to yours. And the way we do that is by asking 4 simple questions. We ask people, first of all, to picture a place, any place in the world that has special meaning to them. And we ask them to write and sketch their answer. For example, I write down NOLA for New Orleans, Louisiana, and I sketch a hurricane symbol. I lower the artistic bar with my sketch. The second question we ask is picture that place that you care about, affected by extreme weather or climate change, and write and sketch the threat. When I think about New Orleans, I think about floods, and that's my sketch of a house flooded. Third question we ask with a grown-up audience is picture that place how you'd like it to look in 40 to 50 years. Not what you think it'll look like, but your aspiration. When we do this with high school and middle school students, we say, picture what you'd like that place to look like when you're your parents' age, because that's about as far as they can imagine. But for grown-ups, we say 40 to 50 years. And the last question we ask is, picture something you can do now to work towards that vision that you have 40 to 50 years from now. And then we go back through with the group and ask people to share their answers. Now, you remember we started with climate silence. The hardest part of running this workshop, which runs about 40 minutes, is getting people to stop talking. We've done this with thousands of people. Everybody has a place they care about. And when they describe it, it's usually in a paragraph, not one word. Everybody knows the threat, whether it's wildfires or floods or whatever it is. Everybody knows what their aspiration is. And I used to say that older adults were living climate memory because older adults would usually say, I'd like it to look like it looked 10, 20 years ago. I don't say that anymore because now we hear high school and college students say, I'd like the place I care about to look like it looked like 10 years ago, which for me is chilling because that says we're all living climate memory now. But when you get to that fourth question, what can you do about it? What next steps can you take? Depending upon the audience, somewhere between 50 to 80% of people are stumped. They have no idea. Now, as a psychologist, if I just left half the audience anxious and depressed, Great for business, but not good for climate action. So before I tell you what we do to get them out of that, remember I said talking about climate change, keep it social, short, and positive. And that's what our questions have done. Social by focusing on a place, short by focusing on 40 to 50 years, and now positive, we will leave people with a very clear thing to do. And we do that using one of four ways. We have a trifold, which I'm going to describe in a minute. We have climate cards for grown-ups and for kids. We have an online version, which came in very handy during the pandemic. And we have a poster version for larger events. But I'm just going to talk about the trifold in the few minutes that I have left. So on an 11 by 17 piece of paper, heavy stock, we can do all the work of the workshop. And what we do is we provide people with 32 different climate actions that they can take. And we ask them to categorize it into one of three categories: things I already do, things I could do, and no way. These things I either cannot or will not do. On the trifold, we just ask them to check off the box that applies to that particular item. I've done this with groups as small as 10 and as big as 100. And the trifold works very well and is also cost-effective and sustainable. At the end, each person leaves with a specific climate commitment of what they will do, their next step, a positive next step. Now, we have trained people to run this workshop, engaging older adults both as trainees and as audience members. For example, we have colleagues in the Minneapolis Twin Cities Elders Climate Action Unit who are using our materials with Osher Lifelong Learning Institute students. They're running 3 or 4 workshops each year, getting people to think about, what can I do in my own community? We've trained Al Gore's climate reality leaders to use these materials in their local communities. And most of those leaders are older adults. Members of church and civic groups have run them in their own communities. And also the local village programs in Chicago and St. Louis and Washington have run these. Now, one thing all of us can do is to talk about climate change. Katharine Hayhoe, a major climate communicator, was asked, if you're going to do one thing, what can you do? And she said, talk about it. Tony Leiserowitz, the head of the Yale program on climate change communication, says talking about climate change is our superpower. So a lot of what we're doing now is urging older adults to have intergenerational conversations, particularly with younger adults. Why? Because recent data suggests that 60% of American youth say they are dismissed when they raise climate concerns. They're not being heard. So if you're going to do one thing after today's conversation, talk with people about your climate concerns. Talk with people in your circle of influence. How do you start that conversation? Easy. Keep it social, short, and positive. Ask people, start by asking them if they have a place they really care about. Everybody has a place they care about. And you know the other 3 questions. If you want some additional resources on this topic, one book is by Katharine Hayhoe called Saving Us, a great book on how to talk to people who disagree with you about climate change. Another resource by Tony Leiserowitz and his colleagues at Yale is called Global Warming's 6 Americas. They also have international comparisons about these patterns across international communities. And then I put a plug in for the summer issue of 2022 from the American Society on Aging, Generations on the Climate Crisis, What's Aging Got to Do with It? In the end, I agree with Jane Goodall. No one can do everything, but everyone can do something. And as gerontologists, we need to be climate literate, seeing older adults not solely as victims of climate change, but also as potential leaders of climate action. And I look forward to your questions in the Q&A after Leah.
Thank you so much. That was really, truly wonderful, very inspirational, and lots of actual action items. So appreciate that. And I think it dovetails very nicely into the next talk, by Professor Alon, Ageism, Intergenerational Solidarity, and Intergenerational Conflict in the Age of Climate Change. I'll let you take the reins now.
Thank you. So maybe I would start by thanking Angie for being our ongoing moderator at this point. And also thank you, Mick, for a wonderful talk. That is a great leeway to what I will be talking about. And maybe I will start by telling you about my journey to the topic of climate change. And actually, I wasn't that interested in climate change up until a couple of years ago. But because of my research on ageism, I realized that there is a very strong component of intergenerational relations and ageism and blaming of both younger people and older people. And this is what really has led me to the topic of climate change. And I would like to acknowledge some of my collaborators on the various work that we have been doing on the topic. I want to acknowledge St. Judy Roy, who's been working with me quite a lot, and Carl Pilmer, who is here today, and we've worked together on the topic. Nora Keating, Kieran Rapiro, and Carlos de Maduca Lima, and also Omer Aloni. So we've worked on a couple of studies on the topic, and I will present only one of them. But I will start by saying that as I delved into the topic of climate change, I really have realized that it's a major issue, especially for older people, but obviously for all of us. And you might say, how come I realized that only recently? Well, I think it's a problem of communication, you know. Maybe in some places in the world, people are more engaged with climate change. In other people, I think people are more concerned about other things. And I wasn't that much into climate change up until recently. But then I've realized that it's really a major threat to our well-being and also to our human rights. It threatens our access to clean air, water, food supply, and obviously adequate security and shelter. In the case of older people, as was discussed in our last session, it really is a huge risk for mortality and physical health. I will touch on mental health consequences associated with climate change. And in the case of older people, actually, I would say that the results are mixed. It's not that older people are not affected. They are certainly affected when it comes to mental health. And they tend to report high levels of stress, trauma, anxiety, depression, even suicidality and substance abuse. However, results are mixed when older people are compared to younger people. And it's not necessarily that they're more vulnerable than younger people when it comes to mental health, to these mental health consequences. And we actually know that many times in many studies, it is younger people who report higher levels of eco-anxiety, anxiety about changing climate. In terms of dementia, obviously, air pollution is a major risk for dementia, and it is something that affects mainly older people. We have to think about climate change and its effects, and also the engagement of people with climate change. And I will be talking about that a little more later as something that affects us not only because of our age. So if I said that, yeah, older people are more likely to die because of changing climate, or more likely to have severe health consequences, compared to younger people, it's certainly not only age alone, and we really have to think about it as a concept in intersection. So it's older people in intersection with gender, and there is some literature, though I think that there is now coming up additional literature, but at least the early original literature that has studied gender issues with regard to climate change. There's been a lot of talk about women being more likely to be harmed by the changing climate and less likely to have their voice heard in the context of climate policy and climate action. We certainly know that climate change does not affect all countries and all nations and all continents at an equal level, and it's the developed world that has produced a lot of the hazards and the consequences associated with the changing climate. Yet it's the developing world that is now suffering through the consequences of the climate change. And obviously, socioeconomic status is a major factor that impacts people's ability both to have a voice in the climate discourse, but also their ability to survive the changing climate and to stay resilient to those changes. In the case of older people with mental health conditions, clearly this is a group that is more vulnerable, is more fragile, because usually people with mental health conditions are less likely to have social support, yet they are more likely to be dependent upon others during evacuation, for instance, or to learn about hazards that are threatening their lives. We know that older people in long-term care settings are more likely to be at risk for mortality during evacuation. They're also at risk for violence, abuse, and neglect during evacuation. So again, it's this intersectionality. And I'm talking here really briefly about mental health conditions, because I think that it is actually also something that is impacted by the next topic that I will discuss more in depth, which is intergenerational relations in the context of the changing climate. And this too has an impact on people's mental health. And this really was, as I said, was the main reason why I became interested in the topic of climate change. So when we're talking about intergenerational relations, we're talking about reciprocal relations between members of several generations. And I think that Mick's talk was a really good introduction to my talk, because he was showing photos of his grandchildren there, talking about why climate change really makes a difference for him and why he is thinking about climate change. So I think it's a good example of intergenerational relations and solidarity at place. And there are many benefits for intergenerational solidarity, which relate both to younger people and older people. We know that intergenerational solidarity is associated with lower levels of loneliness, a greater sense of meaning, better quality of life, and it's also likely to reduce negative stereotypes towards older people. However, despite the positivity of intergenerational solidarity, there is always the risk of intergenerational conflict. And conflict have the potential to increase ageism, which can be either self-directed by older people blaming themselves and viewing themselves as victims or as the perpetrators of the changing climate, but also from external sources. And the study that I will briefly discuss really looks at intergenerational relations in the context of the climate change discourse. And basically, we took into account both younger and older people as potential victims of tension and conflict in the climate change discourse, but also we looked at this study as an opportunity to possibly highlight the need for intergenerational cooperation and solidarity between people of different age groups. We started the study by conducting Google search of top influential climate activists around the world, and we used a couple of different searches to come up with a list of climate fighters from all over the world. We ended up with a pretty substantial list, and our main question was to look at how these activists in their online communication discuss who and what is responsible for the changing climate. We came up with a list of 50 global activists, and when we analyzed their online communication, we looked at both intergenerational tension and conflict, but also at cooperation and solidarity. And I will give you a couple of examples of both. When the activists were talking about intergenerational tension, they explicitly blamed adults and many times older adults, older generations, for the current situation. And they attributed that to past actions of older people throughout their life associated with the high carbon footprint of adults and older people, but also they attributed that to current inaction that endangers the future of current younger generations. They also spoke about the suppression of youth voice and the limited ability of younger people to really affect current policy. And here are two examples. Greta Thunberg is probably the most well-known speaker of the climate change movement. I don't think she's 17 anymore, but she was 17 at the time that she communicated that. And I think that this is a good example of intergenerational tension, or at least it was classified as such by us, and I will read it quickly. You say you love your children above all else, and yet you are stealing their future in front of their eyes. Until you start focusing on what needs to be done rather than what is politically possible, there is no hope. We cannot solve a crisis without treating it as a crisis. So I would say that the activists that expressed intergenerational tension were young to the most part, younger activists, pretty much at the global level. On the other hand, we also were able to identify messages of solidarity that were conveyed by activists. And these activists really were able to recognize the same reality that was conveyed by the previous messages that I showed. They also spoke about past inaction that has really generated pretty substantial consequences for the present situation. And they also spoke about present inaction that does not really mitigate and adapt well to the current climate situation. The difference was that they focused on younger generations as victims and older generations as perpetrators, but also as change makers. And this was the difference. And older generations really accepted the responsibility for the present. And by accepting this responsibility, they actually provided legitimacy to younger people's narrative. So the people who expressed solidarity, the activists, the global activists that expressed solidarity, were substantially older. And even though they agreed with the activists that expressed tension, they did it in a slightly different tone. And here is one example. Our responsibility is to leave our home better than we found it, so that future generations, no matter where they are born or to whom, can thrive. I saw a species literally disappear in my lifetime. We don't become mothers to hand over something that is diminishing to our children. So again, the discourse is still paying attention to the temporal effects of climate change and the fact that it is the younger generations who are going to be affected by more severe climates and for a longer period of time. Nonetheless, I think that there was more discussion or more flavor of responsibility here, ability to take responsibility, and also provide legitimacy to younger people's concerns. This is another example of intergenerational solidarity, and I'm not going to go into that. But again, I think it shows that that there is, I think, something that is more collaborative in this message compared to the messages that were conveyed by activists that were talking about conflict between the generations. To conclude, I would say that both activists that emphasized tension and the ones that emphasized conflict and collaboration and solidarity actually highlight the short window of opportunity and the fact that we have to act at this point for the benefit and for the safety of the future generations. And both also emphasize the responsibility of adults and older people, given the fact that younger people actually really do not have a voice to impact current climate policy, and really are powerless and dependent upon adults and older people to take action for them. I think that there is something quite polarizing in the climate change discourse, and intergenerational discourse that alienates collaborators is really going to become ineffective, or has been ineffective. I think that we really have to move into a more collaborative discourse that does not blame one side or another, but really work in collaboration and cooperation between the generations to really produce a change. And some ideas that actually come from a different study that we conducted, where we interviewed climate activists, and this is a different type of activist, because the previous study focused on those that are at the front, the ones that have major Twitter accounts and are considered to be world leaders. Here we just interviewed lay people who are activists, who are part of the movement at various age groups from all over the world. And what we were able to find here was that they were talking actually a lot about compassion as a tactic that has to be used as part of the climate change movement. And compassion from younger generations to older generations means that they have to use forgiveness for past inaction, even for present inaction, empathy and understanding. Whereas compassion from older people to younger people should involve advocacy, lifestyle changes, and also the transmission of knowledge and skills from older people to younger people. So a more collaborative and compassionate discourse might result in better impact in terms of the climate change movement. To conclude, I think that in general, in order to improve our understanding of the climate change, both effects, but also our ability to impact it, to impact policy, and to be engaged in the climate movement, I think we have to move away from just looking at gender, myself as a from just looking at age, myself as a gerontologist, to looking at intersection. It's certainly not all the people are the same. We know that, and we know that in the context of climate change. And obviously, there are many different attributes that affect people. Ability to stay resilient in the face of changing climate, but also to become involved in the climate change movement. There is also, I think, a need to move towards critical gerontology that really views the role of social institutes in turning natural hazards into disasters. And this session is devoted to climate change activists and what we can do as individuals. But I think that there is also a need for top-down policies that are currently lacking, both at the global level, but also at the national level in many places, and at the local level. We know that policies that address climate change often neglect older people. And I would say that this is one more indicator of ageism towards older people, because we know that they are affected, and actually more severely affected when it comes to health conditions and mortality. Nonetheless, there are very few policies on the topic of climate change that take into account older people. And in the case of policies that concern older people, climate change has not been discussed enough. We need to move into collaborative intergenerational efforts as part of the climate change movement. And it certainly has a great prospect. And I think that Carl Pilmer was talking about that last time, about the involvement of older people in the climate change movement. But I think that it needs to be done through solidarity and intergenerational collaboration. And this is not as much the case at this point. I would say that at this point, the climate change movement is characterized by younger people's involvement, and older people are at the backward. And there is also an age component to the climate change movement. So different organizations are identified by the age and many times by the gender of their members. And I think that this could be a disadvantage. And perhaps we should move more into collaborative work between the generations. When we talk about ageism, we know that educational interventions that explain people about ageism and also intergenerational contact help. I would say that the same mechanisms can also help to bring people together as part of the climate change movement. So more education about climate change, about what we can be doing, just like we've heard in the previous presentation, and more activities that combine the different generations, that help to collaborate between the generations with regard to the climate change movement, I think are going to be quite helpful in taking the climate change movement one step forward. And obviously, I will have to argue here that we need a UN Convention for the Rights of Older People. And it seems to be disconnected from the climate change, but it's not, because I started my presentation by saying that the climate change is really a threat to our human rights. And if the rights of all the people are acknowledged and protected by legally binding document, I think that the resilience of all the people in the face of the changing climate is also going to improve. I would like to acknowledge some of the work that this presentation was based on, and I will be happy to share the slides with you so you can take a look at these references. And I'm going to conclude with something that is completely different, but it's not completely different. I wanted to acknowledge the fact that I'm living in Israel right now, and my country has a pretty fragile democracy that is being threatened by its own government at this point. And the fact that I'm able to speak with you still from Israel is not something that I can take for granted. So I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that without democracy, there will be no research on climate change, on older people, on it, nothing basically. So I just had to say that today, since today we have pretty major discussion with regard to the judicial overall. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Alon, and for bringing that back to current events and in a variety of different ways. There's a lot of ways that we can connect all of these issues. So I appreciate both of you for your excellent presentations, for getting us thinking. And so this is a chance now for our participants to put their questions in the chat, and I can field them for our speakers. So while you're thinking about your questions and writing them in the chat, we have a couple of questions for our speakers in the interim. Our first question is, what are some of the biggest challenges in your work?
Well, I'll start. Leah, thank you very much for your presentation. I think one of the biggest challenges is getting people to think that taking individual action can make a difference. And I come from the school of psychology that says the psychology of small wins leads to big results. For example, when we do our workshops, we start by focusing on individual action. But inevitably, once we have people talking, they quickly say, oh yeah, I can do my individual action. But what can we do together as a group? And that leads to much bigger changes, whether it's putting solar panels on the church roof, or changing the composting and food habits of a community of 600 older people, all started with a 40-minute workshop focusing on individual actions, but pretty quickly shifted to what can we collectively do now that we're talking and understand that other people share my concern. But getting over that pessimism that individuals can make a difference is a major challenge because we don't talk about it.
Great, thank you. Professor Alon, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Sure. So I think that a challenge is certainly to communicate the urgency to policy stakeholders. I think this is really challenging, especially when there are so many ongoing things that the policy stakeholders have to deal with. And it's hard to know how the next week is going to look like, let alone think about a policy for the next 20 years. So I would say that that's a major challenge. And I found myself, for instance, in Israel, speaking with policy stakeholders responsible for all the people who, for the first time in their life, realized that, we should be thinking about policies related to climate change and all the people. So I think that, again, it brings me to mix talk about how this connection that seems quite obvious to some of us, it's surprising to others, and especially to all policy stakeholders.
Great. Thank you so much. So while we're still waiting for a few more questions to pop in, what, if anything, has been surprising about your work?
Leah, you want to take that, or?
Sure. Well, as I said, I kind of started the work because I was listening to the climate change movement discourse. And I think that, I was surprised by the fact that there is so much, well, as a researcher, to study with regard to climate change and aging, and so little is still has been addressed. So I think it surprised me the fact that there hasn't been that much research on the topic. And another thing that surprised me was that actually a couple of studies that I did that tried to look at different messages that blame older people, that blame younger people, that don't blame anyone at all. And I didn't find differences actually in people's response. And I was surprised by that because A, I know that the climate change discourse does take age into account, and B, as a gerontologist and as someone who's been studying ageism for so long, I was sure that I would find significant differences, and I ended up with null results. So I was surprised by null results in a couple of studies that just didn't find an effect to the prominence of age, of different age groups as part of the climate situation.
My surprises have really been ageism and intergenerational solidarity. Ageism. When I first started my work, I called it gray and greener. And because I was working with older adults, but as I started to work with college students and high school and middle school students and elementary school students, they didn't want any part of gray, not at all. So we changed the name of our organization to Growing Greener, from gray and greener. Because of ageism among the population and also in the climate community. When I started, most climate organizations said, we don't need to reach out to older adults. We already reached them. But in fact, what they're reaching are the alarmed and not the worried middle, the 40% or more who know something's going on but don't know what to do about it. So ageism is one surprise. The second is intergenerational collaboration. I started by having college students interview or have a climate conversation with somebody from a different generation, somebody from an older generation. As I worked more with older adults, I reversed it. I said, you go have a conversation with somebody from a younger generation. And soon the older adults said, why not have them in the workshop with us? So now we do intergenerational workshops so that the younger and older adults are in the same room, which is also very, very helpful.
Thank you. That's actually great. It dovetails into another question we got about ageism. And so, Leah, if you could actually explain or expand a little bit more about ageism in your work. You talked a little bit about that, but I think this question is asking for a little bit more explanation. That would be helpful.
Well, maybe I will tie it to the question about what surprised me. I think because I'm so tuned towards ageism, towards older people, I was surprised to find that there is quite a lot of research talking about ageism towards younger people in the context of climate change. And younger people feel as if they are deprived of a voice, that their concerns are not being taken seriously, and that they don't have really the ability to impact a situation that is going to be significant in years to come and is going to impact their own life and aging and so forth. So I would say that there is certainly this component of younger people feeling like their concerns are being ridiculed by adults and older people. But on the other hand, what brought me into the topic was listening to the discourse that really blamed older people for their inaction. And I think that I took it personally, and I felt like I'm being blamed for not knowing for a while what should be done. and how it should be done. And certainly, even at this point, I'm sure that things can improve. But I think that there is lack of awareness and understanding and knowledge that could be used as an excuse for inaction in the past. But I think that ageism and blaming is really something that alienates us from the movement, basically. It's very difficult to collaborate when you are being blamed. And without blaming, I think that we can produce more. So I don't know if I was able to touch on that, but I think that there is a strong temporal component associated with the changing climate. There is the history of how we have arrived to this situation, and there is the future that is going to evolve. And the history was produced by certain age groups, and the future will impact different age groups. And I think that when you look at that like that, it's very clear that age is a huge component of the climate change situation and the climate change discourse. And it's really, I think, our duty to turn it into a collaboration or as an effort towards compassion rather than ageism and conflict.
I guess I would add one thing, which is as gerontologists, we're used to thinking about different types of timescales. Paul Baltus, a distinguished psychologist, talked about history-graded influences. Climate change is one of those. It affects everybody alive right now. But cross-cutting that is developmental time. Young adults have different developmental tasks than older adults. So those of us interested in climate action need to respond to that and say, what's going to draw older adults in? Is there a sense of legacy, a sense of responsibility and generativity of future generations? Well, that's not going to draw in young adults, but we'll draw in older adults. What's going to appeal to young adults? What are the development tasks they're working on in the context of this historical challenge? So as gerontologists, we have a great opportunity understanding individual development in the context of a history-graded challenge to say, how can we translate that into specific climate communication strategies to be more effective in getting people to work on policy or individual actions?
Great. We have, I'll do one more question. This was one of the first questions we got. Climate change migration will affect all countries. What can we do?
Well, it's already affecting countries. It's already having an impact. That's part of what we're seeing in the United States on our southern border, in part is driven by climate change. That's a bigger issue in two ways. In an aging world, immigration is a competitive advantage. Most policymakers, at least in our country, don't understand that. I think they understand it more in Europe. By 2050, China's workforce will be shrinking, and the United States' workforce will still be growing. And the only reason is because of immigration. So understanding that climate change is going to put more immigration pressures is critical. And understanding that in the context of an aging society is also critical. It's like a Rubik's Cube of public policy. Unfortunately, in our country right now, the political leadership does not understand that immigration is a competitive advantage in an aging world, and don't understand the ways in which we're already seeing the climate migration pressures that are only going to increase in the coming decades.
Great, thank you. Leah, did you have anything to add? If not, I can conclude this session.
I can just say that when we're thinking about migration, obviously not all migration is due to climate change, but actually it does involve issues of climate. And there is research to show how people who have immigrated even years before they reached old age still miss the climate and the environment they grew up in. And that's another thing that I think that we as gerontologists have to pay attention to. So it's the fact that when people relocate from one environment to another, from one climate to another, they experience distress and emotional sadness associated with the loss of the climate that was familiar to them in their youth.
Angie, could I just add one thing, which is that the kinds of approaches I've been talking about actually translate across cultures and across different countries. We're working now with people in Ireland and Australia and the Netherlands. We culturally adapt them, obviously, because the content differs, but the psychological processes that engage people and break the climate avoidance habit are the same. And so and this is a global challenge, obviously, as Leah has pointed out. So obviously, as we move forward, we need to think about how are the tools and approaches that we know in our own culture work? How do those translate and work across the cultures around the world? Because all of us are facing this challenge together.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you both for sharing your insights, your expertise, and your time. So this has been recorded and we will share it with participants, and the slides should be available as well. 3 more things to just conclude on. One is that this is part of the special interest group from GSA on climate change and aging. So if you're interested in learning more and participate, we welcome you to join. Please do so. In November, GSA's annual conference will be taking place. We'll have a special meeting in person with the special interest group on November 7th. So we welcome you and invite you to come and participate in that. And then please stay tuned for more information about upcoming webinars. We look forward to continuing this webinar series and having you participate in this, this ongoing journey of conversation. So thank you again, and we look forward to communicating and talking with all of you very soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.